Even today, there are 1.4 billion adults who do not have access to a financial account. CGAP, part of the World Bank, is a global partnership dedicated to advancing the excluded, especially women, to tackle the economic and environmental problems we face. I'm Andrew Wilson, and I caught up with CEO Sophie Certain in London to talk about inclusive finance. Sophie, good to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. First of all, most people know about the World Bank, but where does CGAP fit in?
So CGAP is a global partnership of about 30 leading development institutions, including the World Bank. It's housed at the World Bank, but it also serves other institutions. It aims to foster greater financial inclusion and inclusive finance in the world. Fundamentally, our vision is one where everyone on the planet has access to the financial services they need to live a prosperous and resilient life. And we do that by trying to understand what are the opportunities and the solutions. We spark innovation, we build evidence on what works, what doesn't work, and we hope that others, our members, will implement these at scale to ultimately lead to a more inclusive and more resilient world.
Tell us a bit about inclusive finance and climate change.
Well, inclusive finance can really be a pathway through especially addressing the adaptation side of climate change. When we think about climate change, most people think about greening the financial sector, which is financing big projects, say renewable energy projects, to reduce carbon emission. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have poor people who are among those who will be the most affected by the impact of climate change, especially because they tend to live in rural and agricultural areas that will be affected by floods, droughts, etc. And they don't have the means to cope, simply. So financial services, again, can be part of the solutions that we should offer them to boost their resiliency.
The logic is there, but just like the aid model, I imagine it's extremely vulnerable to waste or corruption or to not functioning properly or to simply just withering away as an idea.
Well, what's really important is that the public and the private sector and then support sector organization play their role and do that well. On the one hand, the public sector has a very important role to play because they need to put in place the digital public infrastructure that's needed, because most of these financial solutions are not digital. So we need connectivity, we need rural areas to be connected, we need that at an affordable rate. We also need a regulatory environment that's enabling private actors to play a role. We need consumer protection because there's a lot of risk involved. Sometimes we need subsidies as well, especially when it comes to the poorest or when it comes to the biggest risks, such as climate risks that affect a large group of population. But fundamentally, we also know that fiscal constraints are real in the world today, especially after the pandemic, right? So the private sector can actually also play a very important role. And very encouragingly, actually, we've seen sustainable finance really grow very significantly over the last few years. In fact, we have 1.6 trillion of sustainable finance investment. We had that in 2021 compared to only 179 billion of official aid. So the private sector can play an absolutely important role. And these are, the microfinance institutions, the fintechs, the banks, of course, the telecom operators, the mobile money operators, etc. But then an institution like CGAP comes in because in a very fast-changing world with lots of new challenges, but also a very fast technological advancement and digital advancement, there's lots of risk, lots of opportunities, lots of questions. And we come in to try and explore what works, how to mitigate risk, and make sure others then implement that at scale.
Two things spring to mind when you talk about this. One is the ESG principles. How do they survive through this whole process? And also, how enthusiastic is your communication and your exchange with the private sector? Do they see the value in your project?
Absolutely. Actually, for me, this is one of the most encouraging trends of today's world, in that, in a way, the voices for sustainable development are much louder than before. Actually, even think there is a paradigm shift in the private sector, and focusing on a double bottom line, having both a financially sustainable results, but also a commercial orientation, but also impact, is nearly becoming the norm. And so, yes, our dialogue with the private sector is very encouraging. We see microfinance institutions investing in digital solutions to provide better services, cheaper. We see fintechs playing a much bigger role than before. They still need to learn to go down market. They still need to scale. And for that, they need partnership with those who have bigger balance sheets than them. We see banks starting to partner with fintechs and others, or with MMOs, and going down market. So yes, we see progress, but we are still far from where we want to be, right? I started by saying there's still 1.4 billion people excluded.
Davos last year was all about restoring trust. This year, the talk is all about making progress in a fragmented world. I mean, that suggests that there's a lot of work to be done.
Correct. I think even the trust part is still very important, but because when it comes to digital technological advances and financial services, there's a lot of risk that are still emerging. In fact, risks are increasing. And so there's still a lot of trust to build. But you're also right that the world is extremely fragmented. And when it comes to access to financial services and therefore the ability to empower yourself and be part of, for instance, the digital revolution and progress, the world is completely unequal. The groups that are the most excluded include especially people who live in rural and agricultural areas, women, as I said, youth, migrants, and the elderly. So really, actually, the poorest are those who, not only already are more vulnerable, but have least access to financial services. And so what does that create? It means that when they face a shock, for instance, they tend to resort to very regressive strategies because they don't have the alternative, the financial services they would need to mitigate the shock. So what they do is they reduce consumption, they send their children away from school, especially their girls, and that has been documented during the pandemic, for instance. So financial services are really an alternative for those who are more vulnerable to mitigate shocks, to rebound after shocks, and to seize opportunities and grow.
But also encouraging signs that both government and the private sector around the world are seeing the self-interest in these projects.
Absolutely. I think we see a growing interest across the board for inclusive finance. In fact, in many countries where we work, even in fragile states or in poor countries, we see young entrepreneurs who are investing in fintechs, who are trying to find new innovative solutions, and they really are pushing the frontier, forward in terms of inclusion. We also see governments in many countries really taking concrete steps to creating an enabling environment for those young entrepreneurs and new solutions to flourish. We see them, for instance, putting in place open interoperable payment systems so new actors can participate, open data systems so data can be shared to create credit history for new clients. We see even the incumbent banks actually to start partnering with the new players. So yes, I think things are really changing and there's really a growing interest for making a difference, creating impact across the world. But as I said, the challenges remain and we still need to push this frontier forward.
Overall, though, are you optimistic about the future?
I am, because of mostly two reasons. One is because we've seen progress in financial inclusion already. So the Findex, which is the prominent global source of data on financial inclusion, shows us that from 2017 to 2021, the number of people who have had access to an account has increased from 63% to 71% in developing countries. So that's progress at scale. That shows us that there is a pathway. There is a proof of concept in a way, and it's through digital services. And on the other hand, as I said, we see much more private investment going into inclusive finance. So I think it can be done, but it will require, as I said, everybody to have really their eyes on the outcomes we're trying to influence. And that is to build a more inclusive, a more resilient world. In other words, business as usual will not get us there. We need to intentionally develop financial products that will do that. In fact, there's really three objectives. Scaling up what we've learned, There's still a lot of countries where the basic digital accounts are not there. Then working on solutions to reach these more difficult segments that are still excluded, especially women, given the benefits that that can generate for others, for themselves and for others. And then third, making sure we have products that really address the most important global challenges we have, including adaptation to climate change, responses to shocks, building resiliency against shocks, and then empowering a more inclusive future.
Sophie, thanks very much.